Well, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to make two preliminary comments. First of all, to say thank you very much to Susan for inviting me to give a talk today, and also to thank Malcolm for agreeing yet again to give a talk which follows this one to the Friends. It's extremely kind of him to have given up his time. So, what I want to talk about today is to begin with a broad canvas and look to understand a little as to how the church we have came about. Much of what I say initially would be applicable to churches in general. But first, I want to just spend a moment explaining to you why I came to think about talking about this. And it arose really during lockdown when we were having Zoom services. And after the Zoom service ended, we all had a chat. And you can see in this slide the various people who joined in, or some of the people who joined in to the chat at the end of the service. And it put me in mind of the words from 1 Peter that, like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house. And Bede, in his book on the temple, talked about the temple walls being the nations of believers, courses of stone laid one on top of the other. And I thought it was rather nice that the Zoom screen seemed to show these ashlar stones with the members of the congregation building the spiritual house. But of course, what we're talking about is the physical house. And that is a subject which is rather different and takes us all the way back to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem with its Holy of Holies. And very early in the piece, the early Christians came to believe that Jesus, or should I say God, was present in the church building they worshipped in just the same way as the Jews had done in their beliefs about the temple itself. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But I just also show you a mosaic of the Virgin Mary with Christ effectively enceinte, which is above the entrance into the church of the Kora monastery in Istanbul, formerly Constantinople. And the inscription on that mosaic describes the Virgin Mary as the container of the uncontainable. In other words, whilst God is everywhere and is particularly in each individual Christian soul, he is also within the church in a mystical fashion. And perhaps this is why on the Church of the Holy Cross at Agtamar, which I show in the right-hand roundel, there is a bas-relief of the donation of the church to Christ. Here is the donor, here is the church model, and here is Christ on the right. And it's almost as though they needed to show the church building as a container rather than just being flat relief as the rest of the design is. And I think that's very striking example of Christian belief about it. So moving on to St. Mary's, I think that I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the principal features of the topography and ground plan and elevation. First of all, it's set on a hill above the river. It has a broadly west-east axis and has a 4-cell design, starting with the baptistry at the west end, through which you enter the nave, and then through a great tower arch, you move into the tower before entering through yet another great arch, the sanctuary. And remember here that we're talking about the Romanesque church, so it's the one with the apsidal east end before the 13th century extension was put on. And importantly, I'd point out that across the second tower arch, which was a much more elaborate tower arch than the first one. If you look at it next time you go to the church, there was a beam stretched across on which there was a crucifix, probably with the Virgin Mary on one side and St. John on the other, representing the sacrifice of Christ, of course. And that position is particularly important, and I'll come back to that later on. And then lastly, there's the rising floor levels, that as you proceed from the west end through the church to the sanctuary, to the Holy of Holies, you are rising up. And incidentally, as it happens, the church is also narrowing. Now, how do we look for the origins of all this? Well, I think we have to go back, as I've already suggested, to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem as the forerunner of Christian churches. And this slide shows Jerusalem as it is today from the Mount of Olives, looking across to the Temple Mount. And you can see the Dome of the Rock, which was built in the 7th century, was on the very foundations almost of the Jewish temple, which was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And behind it, and slightly to the right, if I point my cursor over there, you can see two small domes, is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was the church founded by Constantine to contain the burial place of Jesus and also the place where he was crucified. And the fact that the Jewish temple was a forerunner of Christian churches was demonstrated very early on after the recognition of Christianity by Constantine, as Eusebius gave an oration at the dedication of a church that had been rebuilt after the persecution of Diocletian in Tyre, and in which he effectively described the bishop who'd rebuilt it as effectively like the builders of the original temple in Jerusalem. And he went on to interpret the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which I've just pointed out, as the martyrion or witness testimony of the Saviour. And he described it as the new temple of Jerusalem. And throughout the early and Middle Ages, we find writers who refer to the temple as a model for the church buildings. So here we have a ground plan and reconstruction of what the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre might have looked like. Certainly the ground plan is accurate, and the overall features are believed to be an accurate reconstruction of what it looked like originally. The church which Eusebius described as the new temple of Jerusalem. And it has four principal components. One is the atrium or courtyard, through which you move into the basilica or main body of the church. The second element. And the third element is in a courtyard and contained the hill of Calvary, the rock on which Christ was believed to have been crucified, and below which Adam was believed to have been buried. And then moving on from that, you go to the great rotunda of the anastasis or resurrection, with Christ's tomb, the Holy of Holies. Now, looking further at this feature of early churches being based to some extent upon the Temple of Jerusalem, I've set on this slide, on the right, a reconstruction of the plan of the temple in Jerusalem, beside a plan dating from the 16th century of the old St. Peter's Church in Rome. This was drawn just as this church was being pulled down and the new church we know today was being built. And whilst obviously we are only talking in conceptual terms about the two buildings being similar, it is significant that it has a number of comparators. To begin with, the buildings stand on an east-west axis. Now that's unlike the church that we know today, and most churches today, which start from the east and go to the start from the west and go to the east. Then the second comparison is that, as we saw in the slide, the temple was on a mountain or a hill, and in fact, the Church of St. Peter's was built up on a huge platform above the old Circus of Nero, and you had to climb up quite significant number of steps to get into the atrium or courtyard. So to the east, you can see at the bottom of the slide the steps that go up into the atrium, the courtyard, and then beyond that into the body itself of the church and the sanctuary beyond that. Now, if you look at the comparator of the temple, you start with a courtyard outside, which is called the priest's court, and which is effectively equivalent to the atrium. And then you moved into a sanctuary, or the nave as it is in the church of the temple, before you move finally to the Holy of Holies, which in the church is obviously the sanctuary with the high altar. Now, importantly, in the courtyard of the priests, there was a huge bronze laver or bowl containing water, and that was a very important liturgical feature for the priests, who ritually washed themselves in the water of this bronze bowl before they entered the church. And I just want to pursue a little bit further the issue of the atrium as the successor to the priest's court with the bronze laver, because in 1 Kings, the quote on the slide, it's described, he made the cast sea, it stood on 12 oxen, the hind quarters of each were towards the inside. And Eusebius actually described it as the symbol of sacred purification. And again, in Bede in On the Temple, says that the sacrament of baptism both requires of us purity of life in this world and promises us the glory of eternal life, both of which are denoted in the bronze sea. So this particular part of the church is quite clearly architecturally, as well as in design terms, a reflection of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And it's perhaps not therefore surprising that some fonts survive which contain effectively the features of the bronze laver. And I show on the bottom right side a font at Liège by Regnault Duhuy, dating from about 30, 40 years before Iffley was built. And one other aspect of this atrium I want to call to your attention to, actually. First of all, there was an enormous fountain in the middle of the courtyard, which you can see in this attempted reconstruction by an artist, with a pigna or pine cone of bronze, which was in the center of the fountain, and it was plumbed so that water would pour down the sides of it. And the waters in this fountain were used by worshippers coming to worship in St. Peter's, effectively to wash themselves before they went into the church. And importantly, the bronze pine cone is a sign of rebirth and had been for centuries before this time, going back to Mesopotamia and several millennia earlier. And in Christianity, the bronze pine cone symbolized the 4 rivers of paradise, the waters indeed of the font. So although there isn't a baptistry in the atrium here in St. Peter's, that's because it wasn't the Cathedral of Rome, it was the martyrium of St. Peter himself. And the great baptistry in Rome was actually based at the cathedral in the Lateran. Although that's the case, the symbolism is quite clear about the sacred nature of the waters in the font. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the steps up to the atrium, which I've already mentioned, which compares with the fact that if you were arriving to Iffley Church in the Middle Ages, you very often would come by river, and you would have to walk up quite a significant rise to get to the church. And when you got there, you would have the west front at Iffley with its 3 arches, only one admittedly of which is a door. And surely this may be an evocation of the triple entrance that you see in this reconstruction into the atrium at Old St. Peter's. So now I want to pass on to talk about the mindset of the Middle Ages when they were thinking about churches. And I'm taking as an aid to this a vision of a man called Thurkill in the early 13th century. And by no means am I suggesting there is any direct connection between the vision of Thurkill and St. Mary's Iffley. Well, there certainly isn't any direct connection. But what I'm trying to suggest, or I'm going to suggest, is that it indicates the sort of mindset and thought processes of people at this time as to how they regarded churches and elements of churches within them. So the vision of Thurkill, of course, is only one of many, many visions of the other world, the afterlife, which really start with the book of Revelation in the Bible, go right up, for example, to Dante and beyond. And he, in his story, talks about being led by St. Julian after he'd become unconscious. And he was led towards the east, and he came to a church of Mary with a baptistry, which I would like to suggest is analogous to the baptistry we have at Iffley. Moving on, he then said they came to the church of the Congregation of the Saints, which in our church would be the nave. And of course, bear in mind that the nave was the place where the members of the community would have worshipped on a day-to-day basis. And then he says, St. Julian, the vision of Thurkill says, there was a gate in the east wall of this church, the Church of the Congregation of the Saints, which is analogous to the first tower arch at Iffley, which was always open and led to a temple on the Mount of Joy. Now, that's clearly the tower area of my argument. And towards the east of that temple on the Mount of Joy, there was a whole plethora of herbs, flowers, and beautiful trees, and in particular, one tree with a fountain of 4 streams below, and Adam sitting under the tree. And this is the position on which the rood stood in Iffley Church. So it's entirely analogous to the set out in Iffley Church itself. I added into the slide a small reproduction of a 12th century enamel showing the crucifixion of Christ, and below him is Adam, and he's named as Adam, looking up at the crucified Christ, I imagine imploring his redemption, as indeed would be the case. And then the story of Thurkill goes on, and he says he then came to another yet more beautiful gate, which would be equivalent to the east tower arch in the wall, and it was in a wall of gold. And that tower arch led to a temple of golden light, which in Iffley would have been the sanctuary. what I'm trying to suggest is that in the Middle Ages, people saw themselves as living in an earthly existence, which was a reflection of the heavenly one. And that rather like when the Eucharist is said in church and the body and blood of Christ is consecrated in the bread and wine, there is a confluence between the action on the earth of the priest blessing the bread and wine and the actions in heaven of the angels singing and of Christ coming down to represent himself in the body and blood of Christ, himself in the bread and wine. Now, what is interesting about this is that there is a journey in the vision of Thurkill. There is a journey which he goes towards the east, and one of the recent very great scholars on the thought in the Middle Ages and the history of the mind and of memory, Mary Carruthers, has written about ductus, which is a concept related to contemplation. And she writes in a book, in an article called The Concept of Ductus, she writes, ductus is the way by which a work leads someone through itself. That quality in a work's formal patterns, which engages an audience and then sets a viewer or auditor or performer in motion within its structure, an experience more like traveling through stages along a route than like perceiving a whole object. And Paul Crossley, who was professor of the history of art at the Courtauld and at Cambridge, wrote another article in that same work on ducta and memoria charge. He argued that the sculptures on the portals at that great church act as a preparation for the imagery, sacred places, and liturgy inside the church. Very much as I've argued, frankly, with respect to the north and south portals at Iffley. So if one looks at the vision of Thurkill and St. Mary's again, you can think of the building as a machine for contemplation on the pilgrimage of life. From the baptistry, birth and baptism, spiritual rebirth, through the nave, which is life on earth with all its difficulties, temptations, successes, and failures. And in this context, Maximus wrote right way back in the 7th century that the nave of a church was equivalent of earth, whilst the sanctuary obviously was the equivalent of heaven. And then moving through to the tower area, you have the suffering and the need to die to this world. Golgotha, the rood, Adam buried beneath the mount of Christ's crucifixion. And then, of course, the place of the veil before the Holy of Holies, because it was in Matthew's Gospel that it was written that as Christ died on the cross, the veil of the temple was rent in twain. In other words, the Old Testament was the Old Testament, and we were now entering the new creation in Christ. And then, of course, you finally move to the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, God's eternal presence with the altar, as at once Christ's tomb and his throne. This based on the thinking of the Jews that the Ark of the Covenant, which was in the Holy of Holies, was indeed the throne of Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. So what evidence can we adduce that might support what I've been trying to say so far? Well, first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the decoration on the chancel arches. I've argued before, and I'm going to repeat it a little bit, that these are probably mandrakes. Now, the mandrake was a very important medicinal herb in the ancient world. So important that when the great book of Dioscorides on botanical subjects was written in the 6th century, or reproduced in the 6th century, the 2 author portraits of the author both feature a mandrake, and I show one of them on the right-hand side of the screen now. And in a very early Christian text, there is a description about the elephant. There is an animal called the elephant whose copulating is free from wicked desire. If the elephant wishes to produce young, he goes off to the east near paradise, where there is a tree called the mandrake. And equally, in the Song of Songs, that great poem of the Old Testament, which was interpreted as the love affair, if you like, between Christ and his church, or Christ and each individual human soul. In that song, there is a reference to the mandrake giving out fragrance in our gates. And the mandrake was believed to have anesthetic, soporific qualities. It was also thought to have aphrodisiac qualities, as indeed the story about the elephants would suggest is the case. And the concept was believed by Christians in the Middle Ages to be the equivalent, or to symbolize the need for Christians to fall asleep to their sins through the grace of Christ. And then we move on to the sanctuary and the visions of Ezekiel and St. John. And in the vision of Ezekiel, he says, I saw water coming down from the altar. And here, of course, we're beginning to talk again about the 4 rivers of paradise. And in the top right of this slide, you can see a miniature reproduction of the 1220s, 1230s, showing Ezekiel and showing the water pouring down from the altar. And in chapter 22 of Revelation, it said that then the angel showed me the river of the water of life flowing from the throne of God. And it's that which is depicted in the great frescoes of the Church of San Pietro al Monte in Civate, which I've illustrated at the bottom of the page, showing the 4 rivers of paradise flowing from the Chi Rho symbol, the ancient symbol of Christ, in the center of the vault. These are sort of classically personified rivers pouring water out. Here at Iffley, we have a very similar design, because we also have a symbol of Christ in the center of the vault, this time the symbol of the serpent of Christ. Serpent because in the book, in the desert, when the Israelites were plagued by serpents, Moses went to the Almighty and said, what can I do about this plague? And he was told to go back and put a brazen serpent on a stick and hold it out above the people, and any people who looked at it would be saved from the serpents. And which is why it became a symbol of Christ. And of course, the stick raised on which the bronze serpent was raised was the symbol of the cross. And at Iffley, we have a serpent in the middle of the boss in the vault, but we also have 4 pine cones. flowing out down the ribs of the vault. And as we've seen before in Old St. Peter's, the pine cone was a symbol of the four rivers of paradise. I point out in the little illustration at the top of the slide, a mosaic from Daphne Monastery in Greece, which shows the Annunciation to Anna. And she is effectively in paradise. And there is a fountain with a pine cone finial and four streams flowing from it. And lastly, I just go back to the reference in the vision of Thurkill when he said that he found a tree at the bottom of which was a fountain and beside which Adam was sitting, and show you a mosaic in the center of the picture of Christ at the well of Samaria with the Samaritan woman, with the tree of life directly behind and above the well, which is shown in four parts, denoting the four rivers of paradise. And indeed, the inscription above, some of which you can just see in the illustration, is Fons Vivus, the waters of life. So what more could perhaps we look for if we found that in the sanctuary? What could there perhaps have been in the apse at Iffley Church? And I go to the book of Revelation, chapter 4, and in which he says, after this I looked at there in heaven a door stood open, and the voice said, come up here and I will show you what must take place. At once I was in the spirit, and there in heaven stood a throne with one seated on the throne. And at San Pietro Monte, which I've referred to already, beyond the ribbing with the four rivers of paradise, which you can see in this slide, is Christ in the heavenly Jerusalem, sitting on a throne. And it would have been entirely logical that in Iffley, in the apse, there might have been a Christ in majesty, perhaps a little bit akin to the one on the right-hand side, which comes from St. Mary Kempley in Gloucestershire. But what evidence could there be for that apart from the possible comparison with Chivati Church, the Chivati Church? Well, we do at Iffley have two elements in the sanctuary which might be connected with such a vision. First of all, there's a head of a man on his side in the northeast of the sanctuary. And secondly, we have in the southwest corner of the sanctuary the bird rising from the nest, which everyone knows very well. And going back to the book of Revelation, he says, when I saw him, that is the Almighty, I fell as though dead. At once I was in the spirit. And Ezekiel makes a similar claim. Now, in the top left-hand corner of this slide, you can see an illustration of this vision with John prone on his back, similar with his head to lying almost horizontal, like the head in Iffley. And from his mouth, there is a string, if you like, which leads up to a bird hovering beside the vision. Hovering beside the vision of Christ, the Almighty. Could the bird represent the spirit of John And could the ribs of the vaulting be akin to the tethering shown in this illustration of the spirit of John's spirit rising up to the Almighty? And lastly, if one says, well, surely these are sculptures, whereas the fresco in the apse, if there were one, would have been merely painting. And I think you can take comfort, if you like, and I would look to an example of the combination of fresco and sculptures to support the possibility that this is the case. If you look in the center of the slide, there is an image from Saint-Aubin in Angers, which shows the Virgin Mary and Child sculpted between, or held in a mandala by angels. And in the bottom left-hand side of that illustration is an image of the three kings coming to give their gifts, present their gifts to the Christ child. So there you have a distinct, quite clear confluence of sculpture and painting. And of course, all of these sculptures would have been decorated and painted when they were originally in position, when they were originally made. So that's my concluding thought on this. And I look to Christopher Wilson, who wrote in the Gothic Cathedral, the architecture of the great church, 1130 to 1530. Every medieval church was an evocation of the heavenly Jerusalem, the abode of the saved to be established after the completion of the Last Judgment. Peter Brown, who was the great doyen of the cult of saints, would argue that it was more than that, because he has always argued that where the altar was placed with the relics of saints and possibly the true cross, it was a place where heaven and earth meet. Anyway, I have just tried to put flesh on the bones of some of these concepts at St. Mary's, Iffley. Thank you.